Welcome to Class 6 of How Social Transformation Occurs, the Popular Resistance School.
That's right.
So today we're going to talk about, we've gone through kind of what the stages are, what the roles are. Now we're going to talk in this class and the next one about some of the problems that can arise during social movements, some of the obstacles that they hit and what we do about them.
And I think what people will see as we go through the various obstacles is that the obstacles often are a sign the movement is coming of age, it's getting stronger, it's having impact, and the people in power are noticing and trying to respond. So after this lecture, you'll understand how the people in power try to divide and conquer movements. That is like the primary approach to controlling movements. And you'll understand how they try to co-opt. Co-optation of movements is another common approach to dealing with movements, to try to get us off track, take away leaders, confuse. Co-optation is a big one, and it's done through various ways.
Right, which we'll get into
including political parties. And then we'll also explain the role of elections a little bit, which is, I think, a very controversial and difficult one for people to hear, because people really are trained to believe elections are the way you make change.
Right.
That's what good citizens do. They vote. They take that day a year and vote. That's the most important thing you do.
Because we're a democracy, gosh darn it. So we've talked a little bit about divide and conquer before, but let's go back through kind of the three main mechanisms that power holders use to divide and conquer movements. And the first is pitting people against each other. You can blame one group for what's going on and get groups kind of, playing that blame game and not acting in solidarity.
And they can do that like in the media. They can have political leaders saying good things about some people in the movement, the bad protester and the good protester.
Right.
You can have police saying the bad protester, the good protester, so they can pit people against each other.
Right. And you see it. You see people going, but we're peaceful protesters. We're not like those other protesters.
That's right.
So you kind of watch yourself if you fall into that good protester, bad protester kind of thing. Although it's still important to be strategic.
Yes, always important to be strategic.
Right. A second way is that they can give certain privileges or resources to some groups, and then those kind of peel away from the movement or change their goals, as we'll talk about later. And then,
you mean like Van Jones getting a show on CNN? Well, that's just one example.
Right. And then the third kind of mechanism that they use is threatening to withdraw those privileges. So now you've got this, this organization that's fully funded, and you've got staff, and you've got bills to pay, and rent, and all that. And oh well, if you don't behave, we're going to take your funding.
Yes.
Yeah. So those are some three basic strategies of dividing and conquering.
This is a very important slide, and we'll discuss it in more detail for a series of slides. What this comes from is Stratfor. Stratfor is essentially a corporate CIA. They do research on behalf of corporate interests. They do a lot of work against movements for corporations. And this is from a memo they did about how to defeat social movements.
Right.
And what they do is it's a classic divide and conquer, divide and rule strategy. So Stratfor divides the movement into four types of activists, and then seeks to understands the personalities of each of those activists, and then seeks to use those personalities to divide them. The first category is the opportunist. This is someone who sees an opportunity for themselves to gain power, to gain prestige, to make money, to get attention, get a better job, to rise up in the world. An opportunist sees the movement as a chance to advance themselves.
Right.
The realist. A realist is someone who thinks they really want to just make sure they accomplish something. What's realistic? What can we really do?
What's pragmatic?
Right. Not necessarily what's going to solve the problem. They think it's going to solve the problem.
They hope.
Or that's a step towards solving the problem.
Or they think you can't solve the problem, so you have to settle for something.
And that's kind of the mirror image of the idealist. The idealist is somebody who has this vision of a utopia that can really be, this is the solution we want, this is the world we want to see, and how you deal with them is you try to convince them that they're asking for too much.
You know what a common phrase is used by realists?
What's that?
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's a dangerous...
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So that's been used to take power away from activists over and over.
When I first heard that phrase, I actually liked it. But then as I got to know it and understand it, I got to realize that really doesn't make much sense, because you end up compromising so many goals.
Right.
You compromise your vision, which is the perfect, which even though that's kind of a false term,
Right.
which is the real solution,
Right.
and you give it up for the solution that's not real.
Right. Well, it goes back to the whole idea of what's negotiable and what's not.
Right.
And so some things are not negotiable, and, like human rights and people's ability to live and meet their basic needs. And that's not the perfect, that's actually like what we need.
That's the kind of phrase that helps to force the idealist down to being a realist.
Right.
Takes someone who has a vision for what they want to see and pushes them down toward, well, I'll accept that.
Right, because I'm asking for too much.
Right. Then the radical is the group that really sees the whole system, the corruption of the system, the corruption of the policy, and the transformational changes is needed. And to deal with the real radical is to really separate them from the other three.
Make them look fringy.
When you're talking about a divide, they want them to be pushed away as, don't listen to those guys, they're crazy.
Right.
And so you want to discredit them, you want to isolate them, weaken their power in the movement, because their voice is what pulls the idealist to keep confident, that pulls the realist to the real solutions, what we're asking for.
Right.
And the opportunist can see, if we win this one, I'll get so much credit for a transformational change.
Right.
And so the radical really can pull the group together, and the goal of the opposition is to kind of divide the radical from everybody else.
Right. So as we kind of talked about in the last slide, the tactics that the power holders use to divide these four, different types of activist personalities is to buy off the opportunist.
And you do that with
jobs, money, attention on the media. Now you're going to be on CNN.
Access.
Right.
You can meet with this
Meet with the president.
Meet with the president.
Yeah.
Meet with the president's top aide.
Right.
Meet with congressional staff.
Right.
Have a phone number you can call the top staffer at home. I mean, you're really in the middle. You're
important now.
You're important now.
Yeah. As we said, isolate the radicals, and then for the idealists, they cultivate them or educate them about how they're being unrealistic and they need to be more practical.
And also, I think also point out that if you're more practical, you're really going to help a lot of people.
Right. So, the Affordable Care Act included a Medicaid expansion. And so how can you be against the Affordable Care Act when it's giving Medicaid to more people?
You're going to deny the people who don't have any income, these poor people, access to more Medicaid, access to health care?
Right.
Is that really what your ideal is?
And our response was, you don't have to pass this terrible bill to expand Medicaid. We've done it all the time.
Don't go pass a bill that
bails out the
forces people
companies
to buy insurance and
right.
gives billions of dollars a year to the insurance companies in order to expand Medicaid.
Exactly.
You can expand Medicaid on your own.
Exactly, and that would be a great thing, and we would have supported that. And then finally, focusing a lot on the realists to co-opt them and get them to start aligning themselves with the power structure and supporting reforms that don't really challenge the status quo, or that actually don't even really solve the problem.
And you'll see there are various tactics they use to go after the realists. We'll go into those things because that is a very big part of their goal, is to get those realists on their side. Because if the realists get to that position, they can pull the other people or isolate the radicals. Right. And at the bottom point on this, I think is important just to remember for this whole discussion that the government, including the police, security state, the corporations, monitor movements. Mm-hmm. They want to, if someone's just going to do a protest or a march, fine, let them do it. That's
right.
not a big deal. But if they're going to see a
movement
that's
right.
building,
right.
that's going to be doing an ongoing campaign, that has a series of events planned, that's having impacts in various parts of the country or various parts of the county, depending on how big the movement is, then they're going to start to take it more seriously. And when you start to see these kinds of efforts, these divide and rule efforts and these right. other co-optation tactics we'll talk about, that's a sign that they've monitored you and they're taking you seriously.
Right.
And you're making progress.
And you're gaining power. And then we'll talk about infiltration, which is another topic in a whole lecture of its own, because that's a big topic.
It's a very big topic.
So what can we do to counter the power holders when they're trying to divide and conquer us?
Before you even get into what you can do, let's just say that if you listen to the previous lectures and know that you want to have a unified movement, you've already been building situations in your movement that keep people together. Mm-hmm. You know that injury to one is injury to all. You know that you're listening to each other, you're respecting each other, you're already building, just by doing the movement correctly.
Mm-hmm. Playing an effective role.
Yes, you are countering this co-optation strategy.
Right. So, I mean, the first thing is awareness. If you know what they do, then you can try to recognize that when it's happening.
And bring it out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
You're aware. If someone's aware, if you're aware of them trying to do it, say so everybody hears it.
Right. So you see an opportunist being offered a media spot or
An
a
idealist,
job, or then you want to say that to that opportunist, the power holders are trying to buy you off.
or they're trying to isolate the radical.
Right.
They're trying to isolate
This person.
who's been so important to being clear for us.
Right. Right. And then, support idealists because they have that big vision and they want real transformation, and change happens often slowly, and that can be frustrating. So, tell them that, yes, you're right. These are the changes we're working for, and these are the things that we have to be doing in order to build the power to bring that change about.
Exactly. And you want to reward people based on their personality as well.
Mm-hmm.
Being an opportunist doesn't have to be bad.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who wants to try to create a stronger voice, wants to help build a movement and get credit for a success. Well, yeah, they deserve credit for success. And if we create that transformational change that ends police violence,
Right.
or that gives communities control over police, or that puts in place a single-payer healthcare system, opportunities should see that you are going to go down in history
Right.
as a very important person in this country.
I mean, I think you and I have talked about it, that everybody has an ego.
Yes.
And in the movement, sometimes you have to keep that in mind. And if people are valuable to the movement, you want to keep them in the movement. Sometimes you have to, play to their ego a little bit.
And the same thing with radicals. I mean, we need to be very clear that the radical viewpoint that challenges the root cause, that's what radical means, the root, challenges the root causes of the problem, is an important person in the movement, or important people in the movement, because they help us to see more clearly. And so to maintain that principled dissent position, you want to value the radical.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about co-optation or co-option.
Right. So basically the definition is that this is a process by which a group subsumes or acculturates a smaller or weaker group with related interests into their group, or they can start to pull converts away from a group into their group by acting like they are similar to that group, although they don't actually uphold the same values or goals of the original group that they're pulling people from.
It's almost the inverse of what a movement tries to do. When a movement tries to weaken the columns that are holding the power structure in place, we're pulling people
from those columns into the movement.
They're doing the opposite. They're trying to pull people from the movement into the power structure.
Right.
And so it's a very, we're both, it's the same kind of strategy.
We're fighting for the soul
image.
of the people.
We are. It's really about, and you're talking about building national, at this stage of the movement when you're starting to win,
Right.
you're talking about building national consensus.
Right.
And so we want to pull people from the power structure, they want to pull people from the movement.
Back into the power structure, where you're on their playing ground again. And
That's right.
That's where they are the strongest.
And they take the movement off track.
Right. So let's go into how they do that.
Yep.
So this comes from an article written by a group of people that were involved in community mediation coming out of the 1970s. And they did a lot of research looking at kind of what were the tactics of co-optation, what were kind of some of the stages or phases of co-optation that occur. And they talk about three kind of tactics that are used. And the first one is channeling. And that's where you kind of, take the movement off track by channeling it down another path that may look like it's, a path that's going to accomplish the goals you're seeking, but in fact, it actually supports the status quo.
I think the ACA is one of the best examples of that.
The Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act, people wanted health care for all. They wanted a universal system. They wanted single payer.
Mm-hmm. And
Obama knew that. He had been a supporter of single payer in the past when he was in the state Senate in Illinois. And rather than go down that path, he also wanted to please his funders.
Right.
The insurance lobby, the pharmaceutical
and he
lobby.
took tens of millions from the medical.
He got more money. He got more money from them than McCain did.
Right.
And Romney did. He really took their money, and he channeled the movement, the single payer movement, in his direction. It was one of the most brilliant efforts of divide and rule.
Right.
Which we'll talk about as we get to some of the specifics. But it pretended to solve the problem. Affordable care. Everyone wants affordable care. Who's against it?
Universal,
they
guaranteed.
Call it universal, guaranteed, and they even use the term healthcare is human right.
Right.
But in reality, it was none of those things.
Exactly.
It was healthcare as a product, dominated by the insurance industry, and it didn't provide health care to everybody.
Right. Right.
So it didn't accomplish any of the objectives, but they tried to channel, and they successfully channeled a lot of the single-payer movement down that ACA path.
To fighting for what the Democrats wanted.
And you can see it in so many other examples. I'll just give one more just so it's not all about healthcare. Take the issue of police abuse in communities, and the idea some people have advocated for a long time that communities should control the police.
Right.
And what the police advocates turned that into was community policing.
Right. So the people that were advocating community control were really saying we want to have, hiring and firing capability. If we see an officer that's being abusive, we really want to have actually meaningful reform, meaningful power.
We want to set the priorities of the police.
Right.
We don't want people arrested for minor offenses like spitting on the sidewalk or smoking marijuana. Nuisance crimes. We want to focus on violent crimes.
Right.
And instead they turn into community policing, which basically just put a veneer over policing, and it meant more police in communities.
Right.
Under the control.
That was Bill Clinton that expanded.
Bill Clinton was one of many.
Yeah.
Who used that kind of language, and a lot of police allies that I worked with in the drug policy reform movement, I don't think were bad doing it. I don't think were intentionally trying to co-opt. They were just hearing that language and taking it their own way, and it turned out to be a misdirection and channeling the movement in the wrong direction.
Right. Another very common tactic is inclusion and participation. So actually bringing people from the movement into the power structure. It can start out with just being on a board or a panel or a commission or a committee or a task force or whatever. And what it basically does is, as they bring the movement inside that power structure, it can start to shift what people think is possible, and then they actually start supporting the status quo and being defenders of the status quo, and it really undermines the autonomy of organizations. It takes some of the best leaders out of organizations, and so that really depletes the resources of the movement, because then it's hard to find people that have that institutional knowledge, those organizing skills, that expertise for the movement.
Our allies at Black Agenda Report, which is a strong, progressive, black nationalist publication that does a really great job of covering issues from that perspective, often describes black elected officials as misleaders. Leaders who mislead the direction.
The black misleadership class they
talk
about.
Black misleadership class, exactly. And I think that's a real good example of inclusion.
Right.
Make the person a city council member, make them a mayor, and then they adopt the views of the power structure.
Right.
And they get the big salaries, they get the staff, they get the office, they get all the nice.
And I think now I can really make the changes I want to make.
And instead they get co-opted and taken off track.
Right.
And then they take the whole movement off track. I think the civil rights movement was so much stronger in the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King era, when the leadership refused to endorse candidates, did not ally itself with either party, the Democrats or Republicans, and that when the movement got taken off track by becoming part of the Democratic Party, where they got a lot of African Americans elected, but the situation of blacks as far as high levels of incarceration, low levels of education, poor housing, poor incomes, low levels of wealth. All these measures are terrible.
Right.
Even though you have people included in the power structure.
Well, we see this in a very stark way because we live in Baltimore, Maryland, where we've been under Democratic Party control for 50 years, but we have wide, problems of wealth disparity, health disparities, police violence against communities, particularly the black communities, our schools without air conditioning and heat, not enough teachers. We have tripled the investment.
Lead in the water.
That's a huge one. I was going to say we have tripled the investment in our police department that we have in our public health, in our health department. And we have, huge problems in the city with toxic sites and the lead. That it's that's typical kind of black misleadership.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that also is it takes not only takes the movement off track, but it kills it. Participation in elections, participation in government is so low in Baltimore.
Right.
People just feel like, the government's useless.
80% of Democratic Party voters in the city don't vote.
That's right.
Of registered voters don't vote because they don't see the purpose to it.
The people in power just rely on the developers.
Right.
They rely on the black churches.
Right.
And they rely on the people who are hired by the government.
Right.
That's their base.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the rest of the population has very little to say.
Yeah. So there is this paradox of collaboration, and the article that we cite some of this from is listed on the suggested reading. They say that, it's a tricky balance, because at some point, you need the reformers in there who are going to be translating the movement's needs and values to the power holders and trying to make some changes that way, so that you do want to collaborate, but you don't want to collaborate in a way where the movement is weakened or you're taken off track. And we'll get into that.
And it's so key just to keep going back to the basics. What is the grand strategy? What is your vision? What are your goals? And so that people who get involved in the invitation to participate in governance and in collaborating with government know what the movement stands for.
Right.
Because the other thing about being included, it takes time.
Yeah.
You get on a committee, and that's where your time gets going.
Right.
You get asked to research a certain topic, legal issue on fracking, and that's where your focus goes.
Yeah.
And so the participation is something that really takes you off path very quickly.
I remember once being in the Southwest. I can't remember if it was in Arizona or New Mexico, that I was doing kind of a healthcare tour and meeting with activists. And they told me the story of years ago how they had a very strong single payer movement in the state, and then the state created this like task force and invited the movement leaders into this task force, and it completely killed the movement. That's because they were the ones that actually were doing the organizing work.
That's a classic.
Yeah. And then the third one is something that they call salience control, and this is basically where the power holders start to look like they're addressing the movement's needs, and are putting out proposals that sound like what the movement is doing. And so people within the movement start to feel like, oh, well, now they're doing it, so we don't have to fight so much anymore, we're winning this, and the movement backs down. And so this can really disempower a movement. I think about the healthcare as a human right movement in Vermont when they were pursuing their single, trying to do single payer at the state level, and they passed legislation requiring the state to do studies and put in place a universal healthcare system. And then the state, created this commission, this board that was going to then, do the work of putting that together. And the movement really shifted its focus to something else. It shifted to wealth inequality, and it took its eyes off of that committee. And I think that was part of the problem, where then, within a few years, that committee basically came out and said, well, it's going to be so expensive, we can't do it.
I think of also like police review boards. Looks like they're reviewing the activities of police, and that will solve the problem of police abuse, because police will have to answer to somebody. The problem is who's on the police review board.
Exactly.
Who gets to appoint people on the police review board. Now, there are groups that advocate for elected police review boards. I've never seen that put in place. Maybe I've missed it, but I've never seen that put in place. And I think the idea of an elected police review board is a more democratic.
Right.
You might get people on there who actually are maybe a victim of police abuse. That'd be a perfect person to elect. That's a good example of you could get on track, but I've never seen that succeed. Once the police review board is put in place, you're pretty much stuck with the mayor and the police chief picking who's on that board.
Right. And in Baltimore, a lot of complaints that when they complain about something, it's not heard. Not
just Baltimore.
Right.
There are other times, though, I've seen where their solutions actually end up helping us. I mean, and I think I see this in the medical marijuana movement. When we were fighting for medical marijuana, we have the big challenge of the federal government. Schedule 1, marijuana, no accepted medical use. We sued about that. We fought about that. We tried to legislate on that. Got nowhere. It's still, as of today, Schedule 1, no medical use.
Right.
But at the same time, there was a lot of pressure building in states to pass medical marijuana laws. And we had very clear medical marijuana laws that would have challenged that Schedule 1. In fact, they would have declassified or reclassified under state law marijuana as a medical substance.
Right.
And to avoid that, the federal government came in and said, well, what you could do is a medical research law.
Right.
Where patients can apply to be part of a research study.
Right.
And that became the compromise position that state legislators would pass. We passed something like, I think, in 32 states.
Wow.
Big impact. There were literally thousands of patients, New York, Michigan, California, all over the country, doing research studies.
Right. So they were able to get the medicine that they needed.
They got the medicine they needed. And what was interesting was that these research programs that got set up actually got marijuana to patients.
Right.
In fact, the first legal marijuana user, Bob Randall, was a glaucoma patient. And he was able to get his marijuana, and he got a can of about 300 rolled joints every month. And he was able to get it from the federal government. And it was under an IND program, an investigational new drug program. So it was a research project. So he that's the first legal marijuana. That was probably the second or third one as well. But then you had these state laws come into play where you got thousands of patients. Now, that could have co-opted us and taken off a course we couldn't have had, but it didn't. It resulted in research we used in litigation, research that was used in voter initiatives, legislative efforts, and research that showed that smoked marijuana was better than the traditional antiemetics to control nausea for cancer patients, better than antispasm drugs for multiple sclerosis patients, better than glaucoma drugs, and you could actually point to research that showed you were right. And so their effort at co-opting us or putting forth a solution that was really a non-solution and putting it into place ended up actually helping us because we didn't get stopped. And it actually undermined one of their other co-option methods, which was to approve a THC drug, Marinol, which was just THC.
So that's an active component of
that is
medical
like
marijuana.
The federal government did research on THC for psychoactive effects because that's what they consider the active. Marijuana is much more complicated than that. CBDs, CBNs, lots of different things there. And I think that's one reason why the smoked marijuana is more effective than the THC pill. But some of those research state programs compared smoked marijuana to the THC pill, and that really helped to undermine.
And they found that it didn't work.
And in fact, the first research, I don't know if I want to go this too long, but the last point I'll make, the first research showing marijuana as effective antiemetic was a THC study. This is before the state laws. This is in the early 70s. But the first is a THC study on cancer patients to control their nausea. What they found out was some of the patients were dropping out of the study because it wasn't effective. Thankfully, Dr. Norman Zinberg, who was one of the researchers, followed those patients. He was a great Harvard Medical School doctor who I worked with, really great guy. And he followed those THC, those marijuana cancer patients. And what he found was they were using smoked marijuana they bought from the illegal market. And then he interviewed them, included their results in the results published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And so this early THC study actually was what showed smoked marijuana, was more effective than the THC pill.
Interesting. So co-optation can be kind of divided into stages. They aren't pure stages. It's not like the power holders say, oh my gosh, here's a big movement and we have to co-opt it. So first we're going to do this.
Sometimes they do say that.
Sometimes, but first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. It doesn't always happen that way, and
stage is the wrong word.
So the way that they talk about it is that first there's inception and engagement. We'll get into that in more detail. Then there's appropriation. Then there's assimilation, and then finally regulation of whatever the issue is, and then the response from the movement to that. So let's go into more detail about that. So first, under inception, basically what it is there's an issue that comes about that people are concerned about, and so they start to form a movement to address that issue, and they make demands, and sometimes they build alternative systems to try to address that issue in a more of an empowerment kind of model. And then, as that occurs, the power holders start to take notice of, oh, what's going on here? Something is happening. And it's interesting that that they talk about, like, what are some of the motivations of power holders for beginning co-optation, for starting to look like or actually adopt what the movement is the issue that the movement's
starting
talking about.
To engage with the movement.
Right. And sometimes it can be because they actually see that there's a problem and they'd like to address that problem.
Blacks are being abused by police. What can we do about it?
Right. Sometimes it's for political reasons. They're trying to reward, there was a particular organization that helped get them elected and they feel like they have to give some payback for that, or maybe there's an election coming up and this is a popular issue that they can get reelected on. Sometimes it can be for more nefarious purposes, that they actually are co-opting the movement because they see it building power and that it may actually create change, and so they want to take it off track and prevent it from doing that.
Give a lesser change that doesn't really solve the problem, but the movement feels like you're doing something for them. The people who are in the power structure who don't really want that change recognize you're not really challenging them.
Right.
Yeah, so this co-optation strategy really is appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
This is one that we see all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they start to take the language of the movement. Like for a long time, single payer used universal coverage,
Mm-hmm.
and then that was stolen by the non-single payer healthcare people.
They started calling their plans universal plans when they weren't.
That's right. And they start to redefine the terms people use.
Mm-hmm.
Well, universal doesn't really mean fully everybody. It means that, almost everybody.
Universal access.
Yeah.
Everybody can buy insurance,
Right.
but not actually everybody's going to end up being covered. But,
Or decriminalization doesn't really mean that it's not against the law. It means that you just get a civil fine.
right.
And so it's not really decriminalization. It's still against the law, maybe a civil fine or a criminal fine.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, you got a victory. You got less than going to jail for a felony.
Right.
And so the movement gets into it and starts to participate with the power holders in these structures. And people who do that take credit. They're getting some successes out of that,
Mm-hmm.
and so they look more legitimate. They're able to get more money. They're getting access to political, and so the movement's being co-opted into this non-solution.
Yeah, I think particularly when people are trying to build alternative systems, two of the examples that they give in the article, one is about community mediation,
Mm-hmm.
and how community mediation was really initially about creating processes in communities whereby community members could be empowered to solve conflicts that arise in the community themselves. It was really about community empowerment, keeping people out of the judicial system, and building more cohesion in those communities. And instead, the kind of judicial system saw that and started to bring those processes inside of the judicial system and change them. Another example they gave was complementary medicine, and how complementary medicine was kind of its own thing, its own kind of view of what wellness and health are about. And then that started to be brought into more traditional mainstream medical system, and then started to be constrained or brought into the view of kind of Western medical.
A good example that I
practices.
saw in fighting the drug war,
Mm-hmm.
beyond marijuana, fighting the drug war was like 2/3 of the money was going to law enforcement and interdiction, 1/3 to treatment. And one of our arguments was, we're spending so much on law enforcement, it doesn't work, we'll spend more on treatment. And so as a result of that kind of argument, their approach was, let's do drug courts.
Mm-hmm.
Drug courts. And so that meant that the judge, often who was a former alcoholic, who had his own history of abuse with drugs, and had that kind of philosophy of treating alcohol abuse,
Right.
applied that to their view of heroin abuse or cocaine or even marijuana. And the idea was, rather than someone being put in jail, they're put into a treatment program, a mandatory treatment program.
Right.
So this really served a lot of purposes. First, it really made the treatment people very happy.
Right.
That became the major source for their success financially.
Mm-hmm.
When courts are forcing you to go into their program. And, people weren't going in because they thought treatment was going to work. They would have
Or because they were ready to make those
was
changes.
time for them. It was because the courts said go in.
Right.
And it actually had a counterproductive effect for the movement, because what you found out after a few years of it, you found out that there were actually more arrests. Because police thought they were doing something good.
Oh, because they're getting people into treatment.
Getting people into treatment or helping them.
Right.
So I'm going to arrest this person who I normally would let go. I would have ignored. Arrest them, bring them to court. And then on top of that, part of the treatment deal was, okay, I'll put you on probation X amount of time. You do treatment for a while. You get approved by the treatment program. You do some clean urine tests, and I'll end probation.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, very often people failed probation, and they got the sentence anyway. And
Oh,
so
my goodness.
you really found these drug courts were kind of sounded good initially, but as you got into it and saw how they played out, They were actually a co-optation of the movement and a misdirection of the movement, and not only not a solution, but a counterproductive step.
Right.
Very tricky.
Right.
And we saw that, I think, with net neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were making really good progress as a movement, pushing for moving the internet to schedule class two,
Title two.
where we've been treated as a public utility, common carrier, and that would mean everyone had equal access, like everyone get on the train,
Right.
everyone get the bus,
Right.
everyone gets on the internet equally.
Right.
That's net neutrality. And as we were starting to win that, the commissioner, who was at the time appointed by Obama, put up this idea of a hybrid. Keep it in schedule classification 1, which is an information technology, which doesn't have that kind of regulatory control, but also partially in classification 2.
Right.
And so they were trying to co-opt us by taking our ideas, moving classification to public carrier, common carrier, but also putting their foot in the other door too, to keep the internet service providers happy.
Right.
Thankfully, the movement didn't fall for that, and we kept pushing, and we got the common carrier. Now we're still fighting for that now, but that was a successful avoidance
Right.
of that co-option.
Right. So of course there's appropriation, using the movement's language and pulling people into the power structure. So maybe creating some alternatives that look somewhat, or I guess at this phase really it's more about creating committees or task force or ways that people in the movement feel like they're participating. Then if you take that kind of one step further, this is assimilation. So this is where they literally create alternatives within the system that look or sound similar to the alternatives you were trying to create outside of the system, but they don't have the same values and goals of that system. And then you hire people from the movement to run those systems within the power structure, or bring them in to participate in some way. And this is for activists. This can be a very exciting thing because you think, wow, we won. They're adopting what we wanted. They're creating what we wanted. But if it doesn't actually follow the values and goals of the movement, then it's actually taking you off course.
Right. So it doesn't have to only be bringing you into the government. It could also be creating a nonprofit group that's advocating.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Healthcare for America Now.
Right.
We had for a long time Healthcare Now, which was a single-payer advocacy group.
Mm-hmm.
And during the Obamacare debate, the debate on the Affordable Care Act, one of their very effective tools at dividing and controlling the movement was creating this new group, Healthcare for America Now, which is the kind of the difference from Healthcare Now.
Right.
And that group supported the ACA. A lot of them were single-payer supporters.
Right.
But they put aside their goal
Right.
to this non-solution.
And they got a lot of money. They got a lot of access. And
This was playing on the realists.
Mm-hmm.
This is on the pragmatists, on the people who had a visionary view of universal health care for everyone, and minimizing the radicals.
Right.
Classic example of how to do that. They did a brilliant job at it. And as this slide points out, you do it their way, or you lose your resources.
Right.
Or you lose your access. You want to still have access to that committee chairman? You do it our way. You still want to have that funding? And they were getting tens of millions of dollars, this Healthcare for America Now and their allies. You do it our way, or you lose that funding. And we'll bring the funder here to show you lose that funding. Right. And so they really, once they got you in, they controlled you.
Yeah. And in the community mediation example, the court system adopted a community mediation model,
right?
But it wasn't like the one that they were doing in the community, where it was really about bringing in volunteers, empowering community members to solve their problems, taking the time to go through the process of working through that conflict and resolving it. It was more like, well, this is going to take some load off the court system. We're going to have these mediators that people can go to instead of going, through a trial, and they get 30 minutes to present their case, and then the deciders decide what the outcome is, and then it's done. So it was just, it totally didn't represent the values or the empowerment goal and the community building goal that community mediation initially had.
We mentioned civilian control police.
Right.
Turning into community policing.
Right. And
civilian review boards that really are controlled by the police chief and by the mayor.
Right. Right. And then if you want to continue getting access to those resources, as you said, you have to be showing that you're doing what it is the power holders want you to do. And then if you take it another step forward, then these new kind of institutions that are built within the power structure can start to create regulations about how that's done. So it goes from a community-based volunteer type of effort, or what the movement is pushing for, into this new regulated system that can control who can participate, how they participate. And so it's a disempowerment type of thing. It tells communities that you can't solve this problem. We have to have professionals solve this problem. And it may again be violating the values of the movement. And so then the movement has to respond to that by creating an organization or a movement that then can lobby the power holders to try to take that institution or whatever to be what it is that they want it to be. So it's a regulation and then a response by the movement.
I think about the whole movement toward harm reduction in the drug policy field, where you move toward a public health approach that tries to reduce the harm from drug abuse and move away from a law enforcement approach, which relies on law enforcement. I'm thinking about, for example, methadone maintenance. Methadone is a very regulated substance. As an alternative to heroin, people have to do all sorts of things to get into methadone. On the other hand, a true harm reduction program would be low threshold methadone. Few restrictions.
Making it easier.
Easy to get methadone, because who cares if another addict gets your methadone?
Right.
You get the methadone and you use it. You're not using heroin that day. You're not committing crime. You're not buying heroin.
Right.
That's all good. And if some other heroin addict needs a fix to avoid all those
Withdrawal,
problems, and their friend gives them the methadone, who cares?
Right.
But instead, the government comes in and regulates it so obsessively and really makes things problematic.
Right.
Something that could be a much more widely used solution is more minimized by regulation. Sounds like it's a public health approach, but it's really a government control approach.
Right. So how do we avoid co-optation? This is a quote by a community mediator named David Brubaker, and he says, in relationships marked by power imbalances, cooperation and co-optation are nearly indistinguishable. I think the way that I would look at this is that when you have a situation where there's an imbalance of power, you can't have cooperation. Cooperation doesn't occur when there's a difference really in power, because you're serving the power holders. You're being co-opted. I don't know. Maybe you disagree that maybe it's not that pure.
I don't think it's that pure, but I can see that it would be a good broad definition. And I think that how do you deal with that? Well, I think some good examples listed below. If people are aware of what's going on and you verbalize it,
right?
Movements should be very open about discussing how this is potentially part of a process of co-opting us.
Right. They're using our language, but what they're talking about is not our solution.
They're not. They're not really committed to our values.
Right.
They're not committed to our goals. They're not really trying to approach the injustice that the movement is focused on. And of course, it always goes back to that regular, constant concept of reviewing your strategy, whether it's the broad, grand strategy or it's the stage 6 strategy, where you've looked at what your goals are. You've looked at where you are in achieving those goals, and you have to keep evaluating, does that help solve the goal or not? And it's not always an easy question.
No.
I mean, for like marijuana decriminalization, for example, people were going to jail for possessing small amounts of marijuana.
Right.
And so the Stratfor Commission, which was a commission appointed by Richard Nixon, reviewed the impacts of the marijuana laws, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. Stratfor was Raymond Stratfor, the governor of Pennsylvania, and he was picked to be the chairman of that commission because he believed that if you took LSD, and looked at the sky, you would go blind or some nonsense. He believed a lot of the drug madness stories, and he was open about it. But after he took testimony, he ended up coming out in favor of marijuana decriminalization.
Interesting.
And that when his report came out was when Nixon came out with the war on drugs. So that response was, But anyway, the point was that decriminalization sounded really good and probably saved a lot of resources, and a lot of people's lives got improved. And so it was probably the right decision. But there were costs to it. We got marijuana decriminalization. I'm saying the movement got marijuana decriminalization passed in 11 states that covered 1/3 the population. So some big states like California, New York, Ohio. And in 32 other states, we got laws passed that allowed for conditional discharge. If someone was arrested for a marijuana offense, they got a citation, came to court, were put on probation, no arrest record after 6 months or a year. And so no record.
Right.
And so that was 32 states on that, 11 states, that's like 43 states.
Right.
That's a lot of the country got that. But what that meant was going to adult legal marijuana we
Got
lost
harder.
all of our all of the marijuana consumers.
People didn't see it as a problem anymore.
Were not losing their jobs.
Right.
They were not getting arrested. They were not going. So we reduced I think it was the right decision, but it's often a hard decision.
Right.
And you have the same kind of debates with medical marijuana.
Right.
Advancing medical marijuana, does that help the issue of adult legal marijuana or hurt it? And so those are all debates you have to have and try to figure out.
Right. And I think, knowing what your values and your goals are, constantly reminding yourself of what your values and your goals are, and then looking at what's happening, as you said, and seeing, does that serve our values and our goals, and being willing to push back, or, not stop there. Like you did with the medical marijuana studies at the state level, you didn't say, oh, look, now people have access, now we can go home. You said, oh, well, this is happening. We have to keep building towards this goal that we have of declassifying or reclassifying medical marijuana, making it available to everyone who needs it. And so you were able to use that research to serve that end.
Now we get to a big issue.
Yeah, this one.
Because politics in the United States is king.
Right.
People are trained at an early age that the answer to our problems are elect the right people.
Right.
That's where, because we're supposedly a democracy,
Yep.
that's where citizens' power lies,
Right.
is elections.
Right.
And political parties, we have two political parties. It's a very well-entrenched duopoly with laws in place to prevent third parties and
Right.
independent parties from challenging them in any serious way.
Right.
And there's lots, it's a whole other discussion. Lots of different kind of laws and rules and the role of media and money. And so political parties are really good at co-opting movements. The Democratic Party in particular is very good at co-opting movements.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing for me right now. We've had popular resistance in existence for years, and resistance has become a popular concept. And it's so interesting to see the resistance under the Trump era. And some of the resistance leaders are former Hillary Clinton staffers.
Right, or
as
Obama
if she's a
staffers.
resistor.
Right.
Or
right.
Obama staffers. These
Right.
are like the most mainstream people you could have who are part of the power structure.
Right.
They're not resistors. And you can see also how the Democratic Party is really good at creating these front organizations
Mm-hmm.
that look like they're standing for what the movement stands for, because
Right.
the Democratic Party knows what the movement wants.
Right.
They're always doing polling. They're always doing focus groups. They know what the people want.
Right.
And the people's views are on our side by super majorities in many cases on taxing corporations, on taxing wealth, on
Money out of politics.
on single-payer health care.
Right.
You pick an issue
Renewable energy,
on
or
people having
dealing with
living
the
wage
climate crisis.
or
Yeah.
a living wage, dealing with the climate crisis, ending war. All these issues, we have lots of support. And so the Democrats are aware of that, and they try to, their job in the movement, in the two-party system, is to pull those people into the two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
And so they create these front groups. The most recent one, I guess, would be Indivisible,
Right.
led by former Democratic Party staffers, and they were created after the Trump election.
Mm-hmm.
And their job was to get people moving toward challenging Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
challenging Donald Trump, not putting forward solutions,
Right. They didn't want to actually have the Democrats have to stand for anything.
because the Democrats always have this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Do I stand for what the people want? If I do, I lose my funders,
Right.
because Democrats are a Wall Street, big business funded party.
Right.
And they have been for a long time, but particularly since the end of the Carter era in this modern time period. And so they can't really stand for what the people want.
Right.
And so they have to co-opt the movement.
Right.
Indivisible pulled people in to co-opt the movement that way, and challenge when the Republicans brought up challenging health care, the ACA. Indivisible would organize actions at town halls,
Right.
and those actions would focus on
Defending the AC.
tried to focus on defending the ACA. It was really interesting.
That people went farther than that. People
Exactly.
said, no, we're not. No, we want single payer health care.
Which was a kind of a surprise,
Right.
And so they weren't as usual. They did the same
They
thing,
weren't as in control.
and they did the same thing with Move On,
Right.
Democracy for America. These are all Democratic Party groups
Right.
that serve the Democratic Party, but try to pretend to be a movement,
Mm-hmm.
and they do a very good job of doing that. And sometimes you have politicians play that role.
Mm-hmm.
Bernie Sanders stands for a lot of good values, a lot of good issues,
Right.
and has for a long time. and he's labeled independent. But he's not really challenged by the Democratic Party.
He's always really been in Democratic caucuses with the Democrats. He takes money from the Democrats.
Hillary Clinton donated to his Senate
raises
campaign.
money for the Democrats, right? He's in the leadership of the party,
and he's now in leadership as the director of outreach.
right?
So you talk about co-option. That is almost the definition of it.
Yeah.
I want to reach out to people in the movement and bring them into the Democratic Party. Well,
Right.
that's exactly what co-option is.
Yeah.
And with this false belief that you can change the Democratic Party.
Right.
And I say it's false because there's a long, long history. The Democratic Party was founded as a pro-slavery party in the 1820s
By the wealthy.
landowners, and they've always been representing the wealth class, even during their best times, which
Right.
is FDR.
I mean, they were seen in the 19th century as the war party, as the during the Mexican-American War, they were actually viewed as the greater evil because
Compared to the Whigs.
right,
They were both pro-slavery parties.
right,
But the Democrats were the ones that favored the Mexican War.
right,
The Whigs opposed the Mexican War.
right,
And so there was that. The Democrats have consistently played that role of pulling people in from the movement into their party.
right. So there's many of the same techniques that we talked about with co-optation are used by political parties. So channeling, so as we saw, creating groups that get everybody in the movement off doing something. So like the indivisible, don't actually ask the Democrats to do something positive. You just need to be reactionary, constantly pointing to how bad the Republicans or Trump are. Inclusion and participation. So the Democratic Party has the appearance of being a democratic institution because there's state central committees and people get on those committees and they can change their platform at the state level, but at the federal level it doesn't really impact who they nominate or what the party platform is. We've seen over and over again when the Democratic Party does its platform that they go against the interests, they rig it to go against the interest of their constituents. So in 2016, the platform they were designing for that, pro-fracking, wouldn't come out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, wouldn't support, single-payer health care. So people have this idea that they're part of the Democratic Party, they can change it, but it's not designed in a democratic, horizontal structure.
I think an interesting organization like that is the National Organization of Women,
Mm-hmm.
which has a lot of good values. You read what they stand for. They stand for all the right issues as far as women's rights go. They want equal pay. They want full health care, including right to choose an abortion.
And they've supported single payer, at least in name.
But they're totally tied to the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And maybe because Republicans are so bad.
Yeah.
That's always the reason, the greater evil.
Right.
But then they're put in this position of having to support Bill Clinton
Right.
when he's caught with all these sexual harassment and abuse lies.
Right.
And they're out there defending him.
Yeah. It's sad.
It's very sad. And so it's really easy to be co-opted by political parties because people are trained to think power is in the elected officials and not that power is in the people.
Right.
Now, if National Organization of Women really stood up and said, sorry, Bill Clinton, your behavior is unacceptable, and he gets forced out of office and Al Gore comes in, who knows if George Bush would have ever been elected? You don't even know
We
what
never
would
know.
happen. Never know what would happen.
Yeah.
And so I think movements really need to stand for and you see this with the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, a lot of all these big movements that thought they could change the Democratic Party
Right.
found out that the Democratic Party changed them.
Right.
And that's the
And
real
usually
sad
for
thing.
the worse.
And definitely for the worse. And that's the really sad thing, is that these movements that could have really been independent, stood where they believed in, and instead these are all groups that are taken, the Democratic Party takes them for granted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And their votes don't even matter anymore.
Right.
They have no influence on the Republican Party, and the Democrats take them for granted.
Right.
So what does that get you?
Yeah. Not much. So let's talk about kind of some benefits of elections and also the risks of elections. So, benefits of elections is that, if a movement is strong and it's changing the political culture, you can start to impact candidates' positions or party platforms. So if we look throughout history, the abolition movement was around for many decades. I think for 40 years they were trying to create various abolition parties.
From the founding of the country,
Well, there were revolts going on.
Vermont ended slavery at the founding of the country.
Yeah. So basically, there were a lot of abolition parties that were forming, and eventually, the Whigs kind of fell apart. The Democratic Party divided, and actually, Republican Lincoln was elected and somewhat, on an abolition platform.
The most successful third-party president in history, in fact, the only third-party president in history. He came in really after the Whigs had died, but there were four candidates running.
Right.
A divided Democratic Party with two different candidates,
Right.
slightly different names. Another
The
third
Whig.
party, and then the Whigs.
No, the Whigs were gone. That's
They
right.
actually lost at that stage, and the Republican Party, which
Right.
Lincoln led, and he won a four-way race
Right.
with a plurality of the vote.
Right.
And it's an example really of the role that you can play as a positive in a duopoly.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be willing to stand for what you believe in.
Right.
You have to really stand against the duopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
I mean, I think the Green Party, for example, is right on almost every issue.
Right.
But they're really ineffective as far as affecting the political dialogue.
Because the system is so rigged against third parties. But if we think about other times through history, think about the populist movement. That started pushing
1880s, 90s.
right, and then in the early 19
And then the Democratic Party stole one of their issues
right,
and destroyed the populist movement.
right. Then think about the early 1900s with a lot of socialists, Eugene Debs, and the very strong labor movement, and the robber barons, the inequality were coming out of that era, and and basically FDR, because of all of this going on, had to adopt some of the demands of the movement, some of the labor changes, some of the social insurances, and that kind of the movement. In some way, you could say that. Well, it's complicated, right?
Well, you can say a
Because
lot of the Socialist Party and Progressive Party agendas were made real by the New Deal.
Right, and in some ways that may have made people feel like, oh, we're winning now and we don't have to push so much. But the reality is that also there was a very coordinated pushback against, socialists and communists with the whole Red Scare thing, against, the labor movement with laws to weaken labor rights. So it's a complicated thing, but basically the movement won those gains, and then there was a big counterattack on it.
What the movement won is the first point in this first bullet. They changed the political culture.
Right.
If you really can change the political culture, which also means develop national consensus.
Right.
If you really can develop that kind of national consensus on all these big issues, from slavery to union rights to women's rights to environmental protection, pick the issue. If you change the political culture, then the politics will follow you.
Right.
And if you do it consciously, you're not just playing to the Democratic Party, you're playing to both parties.
Right.
You want the Republicans to see the benefits of ending racism. You want the Republicans to see the benefits of a single-payer healthcare system for the economy, for businesses, for
scaling back our
every
empire
family.
and investing in
Yeah, so you really want to change the political culture in such a way that neither party, no candidate,
Right.
can go against the national consensus.
And that was how we won the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I think, you see it right now with single payer. It's interesting because there is a strong support for a national single-payer healthcare system, and the Democrats are actually coming out and saying, "Don't make it a litmus test."
Right.
Which is so funny because it is becoming a litmus test, and they don't want that. So that tells us that we should make it a litmus test.
That seems very likely in the 2020 election. The most likely person in the nomination is going to have to support single payer. And I had to give credit to Bernie Sanders for some of that.
Right.
I mean, the movement's been going on for decades. But Sanders kind of showed that there is enough political support for it that
he ran on it.
You should run on it because
Right.
you'll get the political culture will support you.
Right.
And he's continuing to do that after the last election with his town halls on single payer and also town halls on inequality.
Right.
And so he's also even listened to the movement more on issues on foreign policy. On
Right.
issues of Israel,
Racial
Palestine,
justice as well.
racial justice, and so
Yeah.
the movement's affected him. He's really become as the outreach director for the Democratic Party. He's been listening to the movement and he's reflecting the movement back. So I think insurgents have a role in the duopoly system where you have two Wall Street candidates, two Wall Street parties. An insurgent challenging that can have an impact, and a third party can raise these issues and challenge that as well. And I
Right.
think, though, there is a role in elections, but you got to really recognize that's very limited because
Right.
we live in a mirage democracy.
Right.
It's an oligarchy with very well-managed elections where you're going to usually get a choice of two Wall Street and war candidates from
Right.
both parties.
And how we talked about in the very first lecture about the Harvard Business School study, and also the other, the Page and Gillen studies, the Thomas Hayes study, that show that it doesn't matter who you elect into the system because the system works to represent the interests of the wealthy. But, so elections can be a vehicle when you have someone who's running, who's
Right.
out there talking about, your platform, but they're also a vehicle for the movement because it's an opportunity to bring awareness to your issue. So if there are, town halls going on, events going on, where hundreds of people or thousands of people are gathered, that's an opportunity for you to raise awareness for your issue. And I think,
And that third-party candidate can confront, or the insurgent candidate can confront the status quo candidate.
right. But I was thinking about the women who confronted Bernie Sanders in
Yes,
Seattle
very important.
at an event that was there. And
That was a Black Lives Matter.
right. And that was a very strategic opportunity to say, here's a person, who should be, following these values. He claims to be kind of a social justice person. We see that photo of him all the time at a protest during the civil rights movement, right? And they use that as a platform to raise awareness and generate a lot of, discussion and debate about their issue.
There was a lot of criticism of them.
Right.
In
Well,
fact,
people didn't understand what they were doing.
I remember after that happened,
Uh-huh.
we worked with the Backbone campaign, went to a camp.
We were at the Localize This Action Camp they do every year.
Localize This Action Camp that Backbone does, and we at that camp we decided on what to do as far as our action goes. It was right around that time.
It was a week later.
We did a really fun action where we did this big elephant, and on the elephant it must have been 15,
like 12 feet,
50,
something like
12
that.
to 15 feet.
Inflatable
elephant. And on the elephant it had a big sign across it that said racism. And we set up a living room
Right.
in a public park.
Right.
And
So it was the elephant in the room.
living room. And you and others would be on the outskirts
talking to people.
handing out literature.
Right. We also had white males that were kind of holding on to the elephant, and they had blindfolds on, and I think, did it say
Blinded by white supremacy,
or something
along
like that?
those lines.
Yeah. Or white privilege. I
White
think it said white
privilege.
privilege. They were blinded by white privilege, and
And that was really interesting reaction. But that was right after these women raised the issue. And I
Yeah.
think it totally changed Sanders.
yeah.
He has been so much better since then.
Right.
I mean, and it's, Sanders came from Vermont, which is a very white state. And so
Yeah.
these race issues were not something he had to deal with as a
Are
politician.
you making up,
No,
excuses?
it's not an excuse. It's I'm trying to, if he hadn't responded
Yeah.
to Black Lives Matter's protest and changed his rhetoric and
Mm-hmm.
incorporated that into his constant speech, I'd be much more critical.
Right.
But the fact that these women did an effective protest, even though they got criticized for it, an effective protest that changed Sanders' approach,
Mm-hmm.
put the race issue into the 2016 election,
Right.
I give Sanders credit for listening. I give them credit for putting it out there.
Right.
And it gave us an opportunity to do a fun action.
And actually, that elephant has traveled around the country for other actions, and we brought it to D.C. and put it out in front of the Trump Hotel.
The racism elephant in front of the
Yeah.
Trump Hotel, yes.
Yeah. But the downside is that the power holders want people to believe and constantly tell them that voting is power, that we live in a democracy and voting is like a very powerful thing that you can do, and that you should take your energy and put it into electing candidates, because that's how you're going to get social change. And we know that in this system, it's not about electing candidates. If the movement is working, the candidates who are elected will represent or listen to what it is that the movement's putting forward. But we're on a 2-year election cycle,
That's
and
the
so it
that's
can
the problem.
totally,
That's what I was going to say.
movements
Exactly
are
right.
long-term things, and you have to constantly be nurturing them, analyzing your strategy, organizing, working to build that movement. And if you stop that every 2 years and go into electoral work, then you're really taking away from that movement.
And so you really got to avoid the risks and get the benefits. You really got to be realistic about what can be achieved by elections when you're really trying to transform the system. Now, if you're just trying to make a tiny minor reform, maybe elections make sense. But if you're really trying to deal with these fundamental problems of inequality, of an economic system that's based on finance capitalism that really abuses people in the environment, if you want to deal with racism, if you want to deal with the environmental catastrophe of climate change and widespread pollution,
Right.
you want to deal with these unequal rights of women and people in different communities, elections are not going to be your answer.
Right.
You
And
got to
I'm
really go out and build the movement.
I named a book by John Curl, For All the People.
Yes.
That's John, John Curl, Curl. And he really does a history of the United States and social movements and kind of the institutions that developed in parallel to those social movements, and found that when social movements were really gaining power, there was a lot more move to democratized economic structures like cooperatives and public utilities, and that at the same time there was also third parties that were espousing the values of the movement.
So
and even though they didn't win,
right,
they had an impact.
right, and that's what it's interesting about his book, which is a pretty thick book about the history of cooperatives and cooperation, is how often political movements, cooperatives, economic changes, all these issues really get tied together.
Yeah,
It's very interesting.
It is. So I think that's everything that we wanted to talk about.
On co-option, we're going to be talking more about that issue when we talk about how movements get infiltrated, because that's another form of co-optation, and that's a specific one that really needs a lot of focus. But as we said at the beginning, when you start to see these kinds of examples of the power structure responding to the movement, trying to divide and rule, trying to co-opt your language and your agenda, these are signs that you're winning. And these are signs that you should really come back together, stay independent of the two-party system, stay independent of the government, and build that movement that changes political culture. Keep building that mass movement, because you are on the verge of success, and you're getting national consensus, and you're getting people who are mobilized, and you're really on the verge of victory if you don't let them divide, conquer, and co-opt.
Good advice.